The Protestant Reformation, the English Reformation. Although the original blow against the Roman Catholic Church in England was struck by the head of the government, King Henry VIII, in breaking with Rome, the English monarch had the support of most of his subjects. For this, there were at least three reasons. First, much of the English population had come to resent Rome's corruption and the siphoning off of England's wealth to pay for the glory of the Roman papacy. Second, as we mentioned before, England was the site of one of the original reformers, John Wycliffe, of which there were still traces of Lollardy around. And third, Lutheran ideas swarmed to England due to the number of printing presses. Despite all of this, England would not have broken with Rome had Henry VIII not commanded it due to marital difficulties. In 1521, Henry VIII himself had penned an attack against Martin Luther called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. For this, Pope Leo X rewarded him with the title of Defender of the Faith. By 1527, Henry had been married for 18 years to Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter, Catherine of Aragon. Yet, all the offspring of this union had died in infancy, save Princess Mary. Since Henry needed a male heir to preserve the succession of his Tudor dynasty, and since Catherine was now 42 years old, Henry had to stave off the trouble of succession proven by the War of the Roses. Plus, Henry had grown infatuated with the lady-in-waiting of Catherine, Anne Boleyn, who refused to give in to his advances out of wedlock. The king then appealed to Pope Clement VII to allow the severance of the marriage. Although Catholicism forbade divorce, it did provide that a marriage could be annulled if proof could be given that conditions existing at the time of the wedding had made it unlawful. Catherine had previously been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, for 6 months. He died at the age of 15. Thus, Henry and his ministers rested their case on Leviticus 20, which pronounced it an unclean thing for a man to take his brother's wife, and cursed such a marriage with childlessness. Henry's suit put Clement in a bind. If he rejected Henry's proposal, England would be lost to the Protestants. On the other hand, if the Pope granted Henry's annulment, he would provoke the wrath of Charles V. Catherine of Aragon's nephew, who had just sacked Rome. Clement decided to procrastinate over the issue, which sent Henry into a fury. He fired his top advisors, Archbishop Thomas Wolsey and Sir Thomas More. He eventually lost his patience and resolved to take matters into his own hands. In 1531, the king and his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, convinced an assembly of English clergy to name him the head of the English Church. Cranmer granted Henry his divorce with Catherine of Aragon, and Henry married Anne Boleyn. Next, he convinced the Parliament to sign the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which cut ties with Rome and officially established the Church of England. Henry's church was in effect, however, nothing more than a Catholic church with him at the head. In 1539, Parliament approved the 6 Articles defining the doctrine of the English Church. This reaffirmed everything Catholic except papal authority. This is not to say that Henry saw no opposition to his break with Rome. Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, and John Fisher, the Bishop of York, both refused to swear to support the Act of Supremacy and were executed in 1535. In 1536, a revolt known as the Pilgrimage of Grace broke out in conservative northern England, but Henry brutally suppressed it. Let's take a break and talk about Henry's 6 wives. First was Catherine of Aragon. She was Catholic. She had one daughter, Mary. Remember, in order to avoid any issues like what happened with the War of the Roses, Henry wanted a son to ensure his heir, or his line of succession. Catherine was not providing that, so he wanted a divorce, which caused him to separate from the Catholic Church and create the Church of England. He creates the Church of England. He gets divorced from his Catholic wife, Catherine, sends her and her daughter out to pasture, and marries Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was a lady-in-waiting for Catherine, and she was a Protestant. She did not recognize the power of the Pope. Henry and Anne Boleyn had one daughter. Her name was Elizabeth I. Because of marital infidelities, Anne Boleyn was executed by her husband by chopping off her head. He married a third wife, Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour and Henry and Jane Seymour had one child, Arthur. No, Edward. Edward the Sixth. Henry finally had a son. Jane Seymour died during childbirth. So Henry moved on to marry Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves was his fourth wife, and he never met Anne of Cleves prior to the wedding. He sent his painter out to get a rendering of Anne of Cleves to approve of her prior to the wedding. The painter brought back a painting, and Henry agreed to marry her. She arrived. Henry was disgusted with her looks, told everyone she looked like a horse, and refused to continue on. Well, he married her, but he refused to allow the marriage to last very long. He got a divorce. His fifth wife was Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was a worker of ill repute. She was a prostitute. Catherine Howard did not give up her job easily and because of this was also killed by her husband. The final wife of Henry VIII actually outlasted Henry VIII, Catherine Parr. To discuss how old Henry was and how young Catherine Parr was, or to exemplify this, Catherine Parr was named after Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was queen at the time Catherine Parr was born. Nonetheless, the influence of Protestantism in England was growing, and during the reign of Henry's son, Edward VI, Protestantism broke free. Since Edward, son of third wife Jane Seymour, was only 9 years old when he inherited the crown, the religious policies of the government were dictated by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer and young Edward himself leaned Protestant. Thus, the Church of England drastically was altered. Priests were permitted to marry, English was substituted in for Latin in the services, and most importantly, Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer was created. This was the birth of the Anglican Church. When Edward died at 16, England had definitively entered the Protestant camp, but Edward's strictly Catholic successor and half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, thought otherwise. Mary associated the revolt against Rome with her mother's humiliations and her own removal from succession. She immediately returned England to the Catholic Church and married Philip II, future King of Spain and son of Charles V. Mary's policies were a disaster in that most of England supported the Anglican Church. Plus, her nickname of Bloody Mary came due to the burning of Thomas Cranmer and hundreds of other Protestant loyalists. It would be Mary's half-sister, Queen Elizabeth I, that would solve the problems of the English religion once and for all.